we can start.
A very good afternoon to everybody that has joined in to be part of this very important webinar. I think also a timely conversation taking place, especially in the context of our politics. Lots of questions around how political parties are funded, the cause and the need for greater transparency, while in the same breath, I think there's also an appreciation for the work that it takes to be able to sustain political parties and to fund them in as far as being able to do the work of contesting elections, of keeping in touch with constituencies, etc., etc. So the particular focus for this webinar is towards public funding of political parties. So a lot has been said about private funding of political parties, but we also know that political parties are also publicly funded. Now, not a lot of transparency in terms of what happens to those funds once they actually end up in the coffers of political parties. But is a public funding model a more appropriate model for the future of this country and for the future of our democracy? That's one of the subjects that we're going to be exploring for this afternoon. Unfortunately, we've had a slight change in our program. I hope you will bear with us in that regard. So the ANC Treasurer General Paul Mashatile is now no longer able to join this conversation. In his place is Sipho Mbele, who is the president of the Progressive Business Forum. And we know that that is a forum that works very closely with the ANC. It is housed under the Treasurer General of the ANC and effectively, works to bring various stakeholders together, government, business, etc. And all of that really in pursuit of financial funding and sustainability for the organization. So Sipho Mbele will tell us a little bit more about the work that they do and how he believes they fit into this broader conversation around political party funding. Of course, you would have seen in the media that some leaders in the ANC have been saying that part of the reason why the organization is not receiving the funds that it would ordinarily receive is due to the threshold that have been placed in the Political Party Funding Act, and also saying that the process of reporting is scaring away some of their traditional funders, and that this as part of the review process then needs to take place, because there is a call for an overall review of the Political Party Funding Act. So Mr. Mbele will speak to that when we get started with the program. From My Vote Counts, which is of course the group that is hosting us today, Robin Pasensi, who is a researcher with My Vote Counts, will really be breaking down some of the issues that have come up in relation to the funding of political parties and some of the research and surveys that have been conducted on this issue. On that note, let me not waste any further time. And of course, once both our speakers have had an opportunity to give their opening statements, we'll then open it up to everybody else. There is a chat box. So for all of those of you that may have questions, if you can please just pop onto the Q&A box and drop those questions in there. I will be monitoring it and put those questions then to our delegates. On that note, let me begin by welcoming Mr. Sipho Mbele to give us his address. Sipho, I know that you may not really be fully prepared for the session, but I think you must brace yourself for a robust session and really be prepared for all of the questions that are going to come your way this afternoon. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Katie, and thank to our panelists and the audience that are following the discussions, and thank you to My Vote Counts for organizing this session. I think key to this process is to allow ordinary men and women to understand why this legislation and why we're having this discussion about this legislation. it's also key to give a brief background about this Political Party Funding Act. Firstly, it allows for all political parties that are elected to declare their donors. And it also allows ordinary men and women to make contribution to their own political parties. And this is not only taking place in South Africa, it's a global thing. We've seen it in US, the campaign by Obama. It was funded by ordinary men and women. So this legislation is aimed at ensuring that there's accountability, particularly with regard to who are the sources of funding. Then there was a journey that was took place in the legislature from the 17th when the matter was resolved by the ad hoc committee to look at this legislature and identify what will be the key challenges and what needs to be done. The bit about this legislation, it also allowed for public to make comment around the funding of political parties. Until in 2019, it was promulgated as a legislation. While we must embrace the new legislation because it allows for multi-party democracy fund, it also created some constraints across the board. Amongst others, if you look at the threshold that has been given to political parties, it kind of limits those political parties from able to exercise their work. There's a party like ANC, which relies on the donor funders to do its work. Because of the legislation, we have some limitation because of the threshold, because there are donors whose view is that we need to make sure that, for instance, there are donors who want to give to political parties, but because if they reach beyond a certain threshold, they have to declare. Not because they don't want to declare, but they prefer to do work without being known. There are those who believe in this work because they want to do their work. So there are limitations of the threshold that limits the political party like the African National Congress. Secondly, some of our donors are international donors. And if you look at the legislation, it also limits the international donors, what they can able to give per annum. While we welcome the legislation, but our view is that there's a need for the amendment into the legislation so that we also allow both big political parties and also small political parties so that they can able to widen their net in terms of sources of donors. I think that will be my opening remarks in the debate and also we'll take the questions. Thank you, Katie.
All right, thanks for that, Sipho. I'm going to ask Robin to come up now, and Robin is of course going to give us then a detailed breakdown in terms of some of the issues around political party funding and the various models that can be explored as solutions, answers to this problem. Robin?
Thank you so much, Kathy. Good afternoon to you and to everybody else who has logged on to today's discussion. And thank you to Sipho for stepping in, particularly at the last minute to cover for Paul Mashatile. So hopefully today's discussion will continue to be very robust. I'm going to try and keep my presentation short as well so that we can leave the most time possible to actually have a discussion. But I do have a bit of a brief presentation for you all. So I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll get into that. Okay, so today's discussion, my particular presentation, and hopefully when we get into the questions, is really situated around this broad discussion of how can we move towards greater accountability, but also transparency in our political party financing, taking a view actually of public funding. What this means is that I will provide a brief background to private funding as well and respond to some of the claims that Sipho made in his opening remarks. So where I would really like to situate this presentation and today's conversation is really around this idea of what is it that we want out of our democracy. Now, I know this idea of democracy is very hotly contested, highly debated, not just with ordinary people, but academics. And there are some differing opinions as to what that actually means and the mechanisms by which we can actually make this happen. However, I think by and large, there is an understanding that democracy is this idea that we as ordinary people, each and every individual should have the opportunity to have equal say in how they are governed and over the issues that they feel are most pressing for themselves, particularly in South African context where our constitution places very firmly this idea of the people shall govern. But before we get into this conversation about essentially money in politics, we need to understand, well, what is this link to democracy? So money is a very inextricable part of politics, and here Sipho has alluded to this fact quite clearly. And MVC, and I don't think anybody else really takes the position that money shouldn't be allowed in politics. We understand that political parties need money for their activities, to pay their staff salaries, to pay their overheads, to run election campaigns. So there is a very clear understanding that money exists there. But the money that exists in our politics should really be for this purpose that I described of democracy, to give effect to this idea that each person has a say and a stake in how they are governed. So in our South African context, obviously, we vote for political parties who appoint representatives who should act on our behalf. And so we would imagine that whatever money you are using, generating, is going to go for that purpose. But are we actually seeing accountability, transparency? And what I think is a very good entry point into this discussion is just to take a very brief look at, well, what are South Africans feeling around their democracy, particularly their perceptions of trust? And I think that's a very important component, is do we actually trust our representatives to act on our behalf in the furtherance of these goals of democracy? And here I'd just like to briefly point to research done by Afrobarometer quite recently at the end of 2021. And I've chosen these three specific statistics because they talk to the three branches of government, our executive, our legislature, and the judiciary, in terms of how do ordinary South Africans feel about our democratic institutions. And essentially the takeaway here is that trust in our democratic institutions is both low and declining. In other words, we are on a downward trend of our levels of trust in these institutions. So of those surveyed, 38% only have trust in the president, which means overwhelmingly, almost 70% of people polled have little to no trust in the president as the head of our executive. Only 27% of those polled somewhat trust Parliament, our legislature. And in a sort of new trend, which the report also notes, is that of the three branches of government, previously the judiciary or our courts have come out as being one of the more popular branches of our government, where South Africans have expressed not only keen interest, but trust. And what we've seen in this most recent report from Afrobarometer is that in fact, only 43% of people have trust in our courts. So less than half of those polled actually believe that our courts have the ability to uphold our laws, to actually further our democratic ideals. And this is quite a rather damning look at where we stand with our democracy. If we look even further just at our local government elections last year, only 46% of registered voters actually turned out to vote. One of the major takeaways there is that our official opposition, the DA, and our governing party, the ANC, lost significant metros. We saw smaller political parties like the Patriotic Alliance, like Action SA, gaining traction with voters. And I think one could make a very simple takeaway from that is this seems to be an expression from voters, both in their voter apathy, but in the way that they actually voted as well, that there's a general concern around the status quo. With this, we also have our issues around scandals with corruption, state capture. Earlier this year, we concluded the commission into state capture. We have ongoing allegations of political corruption. At this very moment, allegations around our president and his money. Recent court judgments in respect of Amabongani that talk specifically to intra-party financing, of course, our electricity crisis. So these continue to dominate headlines. And I think they very generally speak to issues of great concern to the South African public. So I think today's conversation is really situated within this context. And when we are talking about money in politics, we are talking about a very important component of how political activities actually get done. So if we are really having this broad discussion of accountability and transparency linked to our democracy, what is it then about money that we need to look at? So what has been clear in the research, not just in South Africa, but really globally speaking, is that there is a concern with the voters that there seems to be an issue with what that money actually does for those who invest in political parties. Now, we don't particularly take the view that each and every donor to a political party is necessarily doing that because they want to exact influence. However, research has shown, and our own ConCourt, our own constitutional court judgments in respect of both Amabongani and My Vote Counts a few years ago, quite firmly reaffirmed that point that there is a toxic relationship that exists between money and politics. And what this relationship speaks to is that you have certain individuals or entities that give vast tracts of money to our politicians, to our political parties, and then they are then able to exert this undue influence. So if a democracy is meant to rest upon the will of the people, but we actually have a situation where it does not rest with the people, but with this really deep-pocketed moneyed elite, then we have a problem in the way in which our democracy is actually expressed. So if we just take a snapshot look at South Africa. So Sipho already spoke about the fact that we have the PPFA, the Political Party Funding Act, and this act really governs private funding. So I just want to make clear in the beginning that private funding is not the only source of political party funding that our political parties receive. Broadly speaking, here in South Africa and across the world, there are two major streams. So you have your private funding and you have public funding. Private funding is just generally defined as funding that doesn't come from the state in any way. So ordinary citizens, you and I, even businesses, we can choose to donate to whatever political party we think best represents our interests. And then you also have public funding, which does in fact come from the public purse. In other words, this comes from your taxpayer money. So if we just take a brief look at private funding specifically. So it's only with the institution of the Political Party Funding Act, which came into effect on the 1st of April last year, that we've actually been able to get really good information about private funding sources. But I do want to make it very clear that these are only for parties who disclosed. So not every single party represented in the National Assembly, for example, actually disclosed their private funding, nor has every single party, in fact, that's registered with the IEC, made a disclosure. So generally speaking, 100,000 Rand, as stipulated by the PPFA, is the minimum amount. So anything there and above, that means you now need to disclose. So of those parties who qualified according to that criteria, in the last year, all those private donations amounted to almost 150 million Rand that those political parties received in total. If we look at that same period in terms of public funding, our represented political parties, so this means you hold a seat either in a national legislature, so parliament or provincial legislature, is upwards of 1.4 billion Rand spent in public funding. Now, when we have these totals, these are not small amounts of money. If we look at research done by such organizations like IDEA, which is the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, in its database of over 120 countries that it polls. This includes almost every country represented on the African continent as well, that over 70% of those countries do in fact require their political parties to disclose financial records for public scrutiny. And the main takeaway here is the point that I mentioned already, is that globally, the trend is that people are very concerned about what money can buy you in terms of influence and political decision-making, and is this actually to the detriment of the voter? Now, in the context of South Africa, I think we have become laser focused in the last few years on the idea of state capture, the scandals that have erupted around that, and obviously because particularly the Zondo Commission has captured the public imagination about this. But I think it's very crucial to understand that our issues with transparency and accountability in party funding did not in fact start with state capture. The progenitor of these things was not simply the Zuma administration. I've included a quote here, which I think is quite relevant, is that as early as 2005, just over a decade into our democracy, you already had academics talking about what is the issue that we have with this in South African politics. And we have one such academic noting that one of the central issues in South African politics post-1994 has in fact been corruption. And here this particular academic outlines that we had in the early days of democracy and continuing to present scandals like the embezzling of pension funds by civil servants. And of course, one of the major issues in the early years of South African democracy being the arms deal. And why this is significant is because what we are looking at is an issue we have about accountable governance and democracy that works for us. And I think it's also worthy to note at this point that almost 3 decades into our democracy, we have only managed to pass one piece of legislation that actively talks about the regulation of money in politics, and that is the Political Party Funding Act. And that act, in and of itself, only deals with one stream of funding, and that is private funding. Now, I just also want to give a little broader look at what the PPFA actually means for us. So in the early 2000s, around 2003, 2004, we actually had IDASA, who one of the prominent civil society organizations of its time, who also took a keen interest in trying to understand the sources of private funding information, partly as a result of some of the scandals like the arms deal. And they'd actually used the legislation of the time, which was the Promotion of Access to Information Act, to submit requests, prior requests, to the 4 major political parties of the time, requesting access to private funding information. And long story short is that they were denied by all 4 of those parties for that particular information. The next move was to have a court application to get access to this using PAIA. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful. Over a decade later, you had My Vote Counts who actually picked up on this work, and we ourselves did submit another court application with regards to access to information for private funding sources in 2016. And we were ultimately successful in that. And what that court judgment rested on very clearly was that access to information is fundamental for the exercising of our rights. If we want to make informed political decisions, that includes knowing who funds our political parties. And inherent in that is this understanding that you need to be accountable and transparent to those who vote for you, to those who put you in power. So if we were just to look at very briefly some of the major takeaways from this first year of the PPFA, it has, I think, in many ways confirmed some of the gut feelings that we've had around funding and sort of elitism in our politics. So as I mentioned, that those who disclosed were those who would have received those qualifying donations, so 100,000 Rand and above. So of the political parties who disclosed, what we managed to note is that at least 50%, in some cases it was up to 70 or even 100%, of the total donations that political parties received only came from 2 to 3 benefactors. So for example, if we look at the ANC, who had upwards of 66 million rands worth of private donations received, 3 donors donated in the upper limit of 15 million rand, meaning that from 3 sources, 45 million rand was given to the party. This is a trend that we saw across political parties who disclosed. And what this generally seems to suggest is that those who vote for the political party, i.e. you and I as ordinary citizens, don't actually have the ability to, as the adage goes, put our money where our mouths are. While we may vote for you and allow you to have those seats in either national or provincial legislatures, this information shines a light on a rather worrying trend that you are actually getting your money from a few elite, wealthy individuals. Now, in the opening remarks, Sipho did mention that one of the issues of the Political Party Funding Act is the threshold amounts. Now, the thresholds are crucial to the PPFA because it's on this basis that we actually do get to see this access to information that was deemed so important by the Constitutional Court. Now, what has actually been a rather worrying trend for My Vote Counts and other civil society organizations and activists has been this very clear trend that the threshold limits can in fact actually be undermined. So I've already mentioned that the upper limit is 15 million rand that a donor can donate to a political party. However, this is only to one political party. That means if I want to donate 15 million rand to party X, I may do so, but I also have the ability to donate 15 million rand to party Y, to party Z, or to whomever I would like to do. So as a single donor, I could easily circumvent this threshold of 15 million rand. Also, I can donate both as a business, but also as an individual. So I could have business A, and as business A, we donate 15 million rand to one party. But then as an individual, I also decide to donate in the upper limit of 15 million rand to that very same party. The Act also is silent on interrelated funds. So let's say, for example, a member of my family also decides to donate from that same source of wealth that comes from me in the upper limit of 15 million rand. You can also do that. So that is also a worrying trend that we have noticed. And also I think speaks to this issue of thresholds being too restrictive, when very clearly in its current formulation, there do appear to be workarounds for that very threshold. The other key important point here, which I think is also important for our discussion on public funding, is that access to information is necessary. So what has been swirling in the media, particularly this year, is as I said, the idea that the threshold limits are in fact too restrictive. And there has been talk that these thresholds, particularly the 100,000 rand disclosure threshold, should in fact be increased. If we were to increase that to reports that we've seen in the media of maybe 500,000 rand or above, that means that at least 60% of the information that we saw with the last year in the PPFA, we would not see. This is a blow to access to information. We've already come off the back of issues with corruption and this issue of influence in politics. Access to information allows for public scrutiny. So to backpedal on the threshold amounts is really to cut to the heart of the PPFA. And I think the last point, which I think is a very good segue into our next portion, which will be about public funding, is that private funding is just one component of the total money that a political party could possibly receive. So now that we've had the PPFA, we now need to turn our attention to, well, this is just one half of this issue. What about the other side? And can we marry those two things? Can we look at creating a funding model that can actually work together for these purposes of accountability and transparency? So I'm just going to take a very brief turn to public funding to sketch what it's like in South Africa at present. So in South Africa, there are really three major ways that you can receive public funding. So on the one hand, you have what is called the Represented Political Parties Fund that is managed and administered by the IEC. Then you also have funds that come from the National Treasury that are allocated directly to provincial legislatures, so to provinces. And then thirdly, also coming from National Treasury, funds allocated to National Parliament. Now, if we just look at the table that we've displayed here, and this information is also available in our first report of this year that we made available around public funding called How Many Rands for Your Vote? We've just outlined, and this is all publicly accessible information as well, what has been the level of spending on from the public to political parties. So in terms of the IEC allocation, which is that Represented Political Parties Fund, if we look at the previous year, we're looking upwards of 164 million Rand spent. If we are looking at national parliament, so the money given to parties represented in national parliament, the money then stands at somewhere around 497 million Rand. And if we look at the money given to provincial legislatures, so to our provinces, then we are looking at a total of like 876 million Rand. And to individual provinces, what that breaks down to is somewhere between 40 to 150 million Rand given to individual provinces. That is for the previous year alone. And remember, this is on top of what political parties would also receive in private funding. Now, we know that the PPFA manages private funding. So what is the legislation that actually looks at public funding? So here's where it gets a little bit more complicated, a little bit more convoluted. So if you're talking about the money that is given out by the National Treasury to Parliament nationally, so here this is managed under the Financial Management of Parliament and Provincial Legislatures Act. If we're looking at a provincial level, in fact, provinces have their own provincial party funding laws where they are also able to determine the allocations of this funding within those acts themselves, so individually. And then the Represented Political Parties Fund is actually managed under the PPFA. So before we had the PPFA, we just had one piece of legislation that governed this particular fund. When the PPFA came into effect, it repealed that legislation, but kept the fund. So the IEC manages that small bit of public funding under the PPFA as well. So just in that year alone, you'll see the total on your screen runs in the billions. So from your taxpayer money, we are giving billions of rands to our political parties. And at this point, I want to take you back to my introduction. We were talking about what does it mean to be in a democracy, that this should be a representation of my thoughts, feelings in how I want to be governed as an ordinary person. So if actually from my money, this is going to political parties, what are you doing with that? And what is this emphasis and perhaps over-reliance on private funding when we also have this robust funding model through public financing? If we look at public funding reporting, what can that tell us about what our political parties are doing for us? Remember, under the PPFA, every quarter, the IEC is mandated to publicly make available those declarations by political parties, and it's available on their website, and they've been very good about being quite timely with that information. But where do I go if I actually want to see what's happening with public funding reporting? So in terms of the Represented Political Parties Fund, the IEC accounts for the spending in its annual reports, and that's quite detailed. But what about provincial? What about national? So for provinces, they account for their public funding in what is called estimates of provincial expenditure reports. When you take a look at that, you'll see that only one province, Mpumalanga, actually reports specifically on what the party receives in public funding, while the other provinces merely give you a cumulative amount. Now, to be fair, more specific details about this is also captured in provincial annual reports. However, the level of information does vary between provinces, and the line items that they use to account for this also varies. So there's no uniform way of reporting on public spending for the money that our political parties receive. And as I said as well, under each provincial party funding legislation that provinces have, they are able to determine their own allocation formulas for how much of that public funding purse can get given to political parties in the province. When we look at Parliament, they also release annual reports about obviously how their budget is spent. But again, as in a similar trend with provincial reporting, there's no real breakdown of how much each party receives and what exactly they are doing with this. Now, this information is again housed in our report, How Many Rands for Your Vote? And what was very clear with this is that even as a civil society organization, to try and gain access to this information, it was particularly difficult. It was not easy to go to one specific website to have all this information housed in one space. And again, I will take you back to what I said earlier. Access to information allows for public scrutiny, allows us to hold our public officials to account. Now, if public funding is on the basis of your taxes, it means I am paying you to do something for me. But I will take you back again to the very beginning of this discussion, where I just outlined where South Africans are feeling with their level of trust in democratic institutions, and it is worryingly low. And if that is the case, then really, what can we do with this public funding that we can actually make it work for us? Now, My Vote Counts actually had a very interesting radio interview with Professor and academic Stephen Friedman for Radio 786 last week. And he made a very interesting observation that I would like to highlight here. So obviously I mentioned that public funding is given to represented political parties. So if you are in the National Assembly, so Parliament, or if you are in a provincial legislature. And this is based on the amount of votes you receive, because votes relate to seats in national or provincial legislature. And on that basis, you will now receive public funding. By and large, the party that has the most seats in either national or provincial legislature is going to receive the lion's share of that public funding. But if I've only voted once for you in a national election, that means in a 5-year period until the next national election, your money each and every year that you get from the public purse is based on what you had at election time. But if we just look at the research by Afrobarometer, we can clearly see that people obviously change. They see information being brought to them, and now they want to change their opinion about their political party. So for example, at a national election, Party A gets 60% of the national vote, and so they're going to receive quite a large chunk of public funding. But 2 or 3 years down the line, public perception is actually now dwindled, and polls indicate that actually this political party only has 40% of the public interest, but they are still going to be receiving money based on that 60% share that they got in the national election. And this is a rather static model. It also speaks to some of the issues that have been raised around public funding, globally speaking, in that even though this comes from the public, there is no incentive once political parties are actually in power to actually make good on the promises that they have made to the electorate, particularly during election times, and they are guaranteed to receive the same level of funding throughout that particular term. But where does that leave the South African public? Now, My Vote Counts is not necessarily advocating for an increase in the fiscus to accommodate for more money to be pumped into public funding. But what we are saying is that since you already have funding from two large streams, you've already made a start, made an attempt at regulating private funding to cut out that undue influence of money. We should also bring into line public funding and try and make that more responsive and representative of the public. So what we really then want to see are public representatives who are working not for their own self-enrichment, but actually in the service of the public. And what we should be perhaps looking at is the ways in which we can engage our current model of public funding and tie that to democratic principles, democratic imperatives that can show the public, well, actually, we are taking you and your money seriously. We've had reports that, oh, private funding is really important. We've seen that our politicians and political parties can become beholden to private influence. But it is us, the people, and here I'll remind you again, the people shall govern. It is us that put our political parties in positions of power. So what are the recourses that we have to make sure that our politicians, our political parties do in fact work for us? So in the recent research that MVC has conducted, we have tried to provide sort of ideas or recommendations on this particular point. And here we've just outlined that very briefly. So public funding can be both direct and indirect funding. So in other words, you're actually getting cash in hand from the treasury, but also indirect in the use of public goods and services. So for example, advertising time on national broadcasters, the use of public venues and the sort. If we want to move away from the situation of over-reliance on private funding, over-reliance on a few individuals, and stimulate broad-based support, and also stimulate really accountability to that broad-based support, we must be able to increase competitiveness and equality in the way in which our political parties are able to contest elections. And to bring direct and indirect funding into line would be one of the ways in which we can do that. To the point about ensuring that public funding is dependent on support of the people, we do need to tie public funding to certain democratic principles or imperatives. So for example, if we recognize that key to democracy is making sure that both men and women have equal say in the way in which our democracy is run, but we also notice that we do not have gender parity in our political representations, we should then in fact, for example, read that in as a criteria for the receipt of public funding. Does your political party advance that, for example? We could even look at, to my other point of not having this static model of public funding, but if I voted for you at the national election and we check in again with those same voters halfway through the cycle, do you still believe in that party? Yes, no. And if there is a decline, then perhaps your allocation should be changed to reflect that. And what we are actually trying to read in here is that political parties should be kept on their toes in wanting to satisfy what the voter wants. What is in the interest of the public, not what is in the interest of the private individual. What we've seen, and a little bit in my discussion with the first year of the PPFA, is obviously this culture of elitism. And perhaps we should be looking at public funding as a way to combat this idea of elitism, to actually raise the voice of the public. Instead of looking to two donors, for example, private donors, to give you 50 million rand cumulatively, let's say 25 million rand each. Why can't you actually be actively working and going out to millions of voters and even asking them, even as a token of their representation, token of their interest in your party, to give that to you instead, and have that be a litmus test of your support by the people, instead of trying to make your base around these wealthy individuals. Of course, I've said this earlier as well, that public funding should be seen as this broader strategy of political funding. We are not making the argument, as I said, that money must not be in politics. But we cannot allow it to be unregulated to such an extent that our politics can be captured by interests that are not represented by the people. So the PPFA, as I said, has made a start. We do now need to look at our public funding as well, particularly given that the reporting is not uniform. It's not as rigorous as the PPFA. It is not that easy to access for ordinary people. The information itself is difficult to navigate and understand. And for the purposes of access to information, that is difficult. The public should be able to scrutinize public funding and private funding as well, to be able to say to our representatives, we are unhappy with this, and not just at the ballot box, but throughout that term as well. What this means as well is that we should also be looking at those spaces in the PPFA that could be shored up. They do in fact cut at the heart of their private funding, which is to make sure that we have accountable and transparent politics. So we need to make sure that both those streams, public and private, dovetail with one another, that they reinforce those ideals. And one of the key ways, I think, is to look at those weaknesses, particularly around the thresholds, and not in the increasing of those thresholds, but at the very least in keeping them where they are, but preferably actually lowering those so that we can see more disclosure actually taking place. And also crucial to both private and public funding is that all information should be made available in a timely manner. As I said, when it comes to the reporting on public funding, this can be very difficult to access, difficult to understand, and therefore hinders their constitutionally protected right of access to information for the purposes of making informed political decisions. And just in closing, what I do want to mention as well, and this is to one the points made by Sipho in his opening address, is on this issue of anonymity. So tied to the idea that the threshold amounts presently as they are in the PPFA are too restrictive, is this idea that because we are now forcing disclosure in the name, particularly of who that donor is, this scares away donors. And I think this will be a good point of discussion for us here today, is that if you as the donor are making a donation above board, you are doing it because you support this party, why would you not want to be known? Is there questions that we should be raising around the nature of the donation, the nature of the donor? And again, to that right of access to information, we do reserve the right to ask the question. And if your donation passes muster, then that's excellent. If it does not, then we also then in that instance reserve the right to take the necessary steps against that. And if the PPFA is in fact restricting certain donations, perhaps we should not be looking at that as a negative, and rather as doing exactly what that act should be doing, which is cutting out those donations that could perhaps have that undue influence that we are talking about. And I just want to leave just with a brief on some statistics on this idea of anonymity as well, is that this is a very core ideal held by countries around the world. In fact, on the continent, just comparatively speaking, in terms of party funding legislation, 51% of African countries ban anonymity. In other words, they want donors' information to be known so that we can scrutinize, but built on the fact that there have been examples of corruption and undue influence. If you look globally, that is the trend for countries in Europe, which is over 70%, countries in South America as well, which is sitting at over 83% as well. So this idea that anonymity really is the reason why donors are not making donations, we should view with some caution. We should ask questions around why is it that you want to remain anonymous, particularly when we look in the South African context, when we have seen issues around private donors exerting this undue influence. And so I will end the presentation there so that we can have this conversation. But really the look for today is to try and understand what have we gleaned from private funding information, what are we currently seeing with public funding information, and how can we use that to better funding models for a more representative and robust democracy.
Thanks for that very comprehensive breakdown there, Robin, into some of the research that you've done. I think just before we get into the Q&A, is the position of My Vote Counts that a two-model system of both private and public funding then is what we need? Or is the push really ultimately to get rid of private funding?
Well, short answer is we already have a dual system. We already have private funding. We already have public funding. I think the position for MVC, especially with the position paper that we have just launched, is that we need to bring those two things, number one, integrate the conversation, and we need to make sure that those funding models, both of them, work for the purpose of accountability and transparency. And just by looking at numbers, our political parties are receiving vast tracts of public money, and we cannot account for what is actually being done with that. So we need an overhaul of that. I think ultimately for MVC, we would like to see less reliance on private funding and more towards a funding that's actually not only gleaned from the public, but is actually responsive and accountable to the public.
All right. Sipho, let me bring you in here.
Yes,
because
I wanted to, okay.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
Issues that were raised by Robin that I think we need to give context on them. I think the first question relates to why funding must be given to political parties in Parliament. Prior to the regulations, prior to the Political Party Funding Act, if you recall that both the National Assembly and the provincial legislatures were giving funds to political parties until the legislations come to effect. The funds that are allocated to political parties are for constituency work. It talks to the aspects of the constitution that says you must, in particular, encouraging community participation on matters of governance. I think that's the first point. The second point that we also need to talk to is around what Robin has raised, that is happening globally. If you look at the German system and the UK system around particular in the UK, it's a constituency-based system. So in that system is that it allows those who want to contest who wants to contest for a seat in the House, they get funding from both from private and from public. But there's a notion that we need also to correct that says political parties must get funding equally. It doesn't apply anywhere in the world. And maybe they can share the case study. Political parties get allocation of funding based on their performance and the electoral support. Because with the aim of trying to limit this thing of the notion that everyone can stand. So what usually happens, and there's few things that happen. Public broadcasters allow political parties, allocate time for political parties to contest election. After they've contested the elections, they are allocated the money that they spent during the campaign period. So allocation cannot be willy-nilly, but it's allocated to political parties. The notion that the parties that don't want that donors to be disclosed, it must also be corrected. The political party funding is about two key objectives. One is about accountability, but secondly is also about transparency. That's why we have this multi-party. So for accountability, you must know these are people. Since the legislation has been enacted and asserted by the president, the ANC has been declaring all the funders to, and even if you go to the IEC website, you'll know which funders that have been giving money. Lastly, we must also address this aspect. Political party funding, it doesn't come because of the Zondo Commission. If you follow the debates post-1994 from former Minister Vale Musa, and former Minister Tito Mboweni, it's the first group of individuals who started saying, we need to have political parties to declare so that they don't have what we call the external influence from international players. And because we understand that it will erode on the sovereignty of the country. So we must also begin to contextualize issues that the political party funding, the discussion it has been there post-1994. We just enacted it because we wanted to regulate the multi-party funding. Where the benefits of the political party funding is that it also allows everyone to have access to funding. If you look at the IEC, you find a party that is not even in parliament, Action SA, they get funding from different sources. It's only SA political, it's only DA and Action SA that they get funding from the same single source. But other Black political parties, they get funding from different individuals. So the notion that the same individuals that give to different parties is only DA and Action SA, but the other political parties like the ANC, I can't speak on behalf of the EFF, they get funding from different individuals. I thought, let me kind of respond to the input from Robin. Thank you.
So Sipho, if then this issue of funding and transparency around that funding was not such a big issue for political parties, why then do we have some members of the ANC going out to publicly say that the reason the party finds itself in this crippling financial problem is because previous individuals who would otherwise be giving money to the organization are withholding that money because they don't want to be part of the disclosure aspect that comes with the PPFA?
We must correct that. It's the issue here, and we must check the submission that was done by the ANC to the minister, is to look at the regulations around the threshold. I think that's the issue here. We're saying that let's allow the regulations, the threshold to increase from 100,000. It must go a little bit higher. I think that's the threshold. It's a normal thing, even in the NGOs, your normal NGOs that deal with poverty alleviation, that deals with women and so forth, or children's rights. There are normal funders will say, we want to make a declarations, but we don't want to be known. It's not only in politics, it's a worldwide thing that we'll see people, even in the green, in the environmental space, there are people who want to give privately who don't want to be known, not because they have anything to hide, it's by their nature. So it's from the side of the ANC, the issue here is that the threshold must be addressed. We're not saying the legislation must be repealed. We're just saying that let's look at the threshold so that to allow those who want to give more without going in public, let them do it. And it's true that legislation, and it's true the IEC processes that they will be able to say, okay, ANC has received so much money, and that money is not going to be used to influence the internal party politics.
But do you then, especially as an entity that is responsible in some ways for that fundraising that ultimately is feeding into the ANC, do you get requests from your potential funders or even funders about the level of transparency that Robin has raised? Because that again seems to be a point of resistance for political parties in terms of how they're actually spending the monies that they're receiving, whether it's from public or private funds. And that doesn't even get into the internal party campaigns that politicians will then also engage in as part of the business, I guess, of politics.
In our case, if you go to our website, it begins to outline, or it shows, if you pay so much, these are the benefits. And we are upfront to our subscribers. For instance, if you have made the contribution of 5,000 rand, you'll get this and this and this. If you paid so much, it's like what, and we call it subscription. It's a subscription because as a subscriber, there are benefits that you deserve. So because of that, our subscribers, they know what is available for money, because we even go beyond what they pay for. For instance, we offer training for subscribers for free. So there is accountability for the work that we do to our subscribers. And because we have that relationship that we've built with our subscribers, we also allow them to raise issues. For instance, let me make an example. One of our subscribers proposed to us that we need to have a discussion on the telecommunication legislation when it was debated previously. We organized that. One of our subscribers, when they complain about access to funding, we organized an engagement with the IDC on Tuesday. So we serve our subscribers. So the subscription that is paid to our subscribers, they see value for it, and we don't hide. The only thing that we don't do is to take the list of our subscribers and take it to public, because it's a private relationship that we have. But we account for the work that we do on a regular basis to our subscribers.
Apologies for that. I don't know why my camera won't switch on anymore. I'm having a bit of difficulty with it. But we can continue nonetheless. So I've got a question here specifically for you, Sipho. And just to cut the long story short, he says, can Sipho clarify as to how then political parties can be held accountable annually throughout their tenure, especially because it's absolutely ridiculous that one has to go on a safari just to get this information. Because again, the level of transparency of what the money is being spent on doesn't really seem to be clear.
There's two ways that political parties account for the work that they do. One, you use the political party manifesto when they campaign for the elections. They made commitments that will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Secondly, through the parliamentary processes and the portfolio committees, political parties are held accountable for the work that they're doing. Thirdly, through the constituency work. For instance, the ANC has parliamentary constituency offices where members of public, they can engage. Lastly, the members of public on specific items, whether any legislation, they are expected to account. If you follow the debates in Parliament, the president set the tone for the year to say this is the commitments of this financial year, and then different ministers will come back and say this is what we'll be doing based on these national priorities, and then opposition parties will hold political parties accountable. But from the side of the ANC, it hosts its own imbizos. I mean, I know that provinces like Gauteng, they will host what you call in Dirisan, where they go to public to account for the work that they're doing. So there is a mechanism and a system that has been used through the parliamentary work that require the political parties to be accountable for the work that they're doing.
All right, thanks for that, Sipho. I know that there are a couple of more questions that have been put up in the Q&A box. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to hand over to Shaylin because I'm on my round of load shedding now. So I think that's part of the reason why my camera is also giving me some difficulty. So Shaylin, I'm going to hand over to you just so that you can continue with the rest of the Q&A session.
Okay, there we go. There's my camera. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you for that, Sipho. Let's just see. I see there is a hand, but let's just check the Q&A box if there's any other questions. I see there is a hand. I'm going to afford you quick 1 minute because I think we do need to wrap up pretty soon as well. So just quickly, who you are, where you're from, and your question. You can unmute.
Yes. Hi.
Yes.
Am I audible enough?
Yeah, bo.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Mzwabantu Zwiden. I just happen to be a participant in the session. I'm not from any organization. I'm just a concerned citizen who just had an interest in participating in the session. And I really want to welcome the very comprehensive presentation from Robin. I've seen that the political parties are just getting quite relatively quite staggering streams of funds with the information that has already been shared in the amounts and the figures and the public funding that political parties get. And I actually note the fact that Mr. Mbele had said that the quantum of the figures that political parties get, they are managed for actually the purposes of the constituency work and all that. But maybe what also could be the very possible reason here, one thing that people need to look into is to perhaps the government to start applying the very stricter mechanisms in monitoring the expenditure patterns of how political parties get to actually spend the public funds that are allocated to them. I've looked into the figure that comes from the National Treasury, Parliament, IEC. These funds are quite huge, just aside from the private funding. The other thing that I want to ask, okay, let me just go straight to my question to Mr. Mbele. I know that he says that the party does not have an issue about the disclosure of the donors, but more about the adjustment. I know that the call for the amendment in the legislation is about the adjustment in the threshold so that it allows the donors to donate, monies just that go just a little bit beyond 100 million. But Robin had said there that at least there is a flexible measure, or rather a provision within the PPFA that allows potential donors to circumvent the process. You can actually donate either as an individual or the business. I'm not sure if the forum does not see that as a sufficient way, or just as a way of maybe navigating the funding challenges that it currently has, even before the formal process of conducting or putting these kind of amendments in place in the current legislations as it currently stands. But now, is there a problem with the party improvising out of the measure that is already currently existing so that it averts challenges of having or dealing with the phenomenon of its ANC staffers not being paid money, and the ANC would cite this particular challenge of the poor flow of, or the issues with private funding, because there is the funding or the funding act that is in place that actually limits it from actually accessing funds from potential donors. I think this should not be cited as the only excuse as to why the party can actually be able to address those kind of challenges. There are measures that are in place that it can work around with. Thank you very much.
Sipho?
Helen, thanks from Mr. Zwide for the question. The reality of the matter is twofold. One is that historically, the major donors, and continuously to be, are international donors who are, I think they contribute something between 60 and 70% towards the ANC funds. And the rest will come from the political party funding, which is allocated 4 times a year from the IEC. And then the other money comes from the ANC membership in a form of a member of the ANC pays 20 Rand per annum. If you split it by 365 days, like 1 cent. Now, your 70% is only limited to a certain amount of money. And we are a political party, which is not a commercial entity. So we work within the regulations that governs us. We cannot go beyond what we get allocated from. Even if we do your membership. So yes, we are looking at those issues. One, looking at increasing of the membership system. Even the subscription fees that are paid to PBF, they make it, it's I think it's between the contribution that we get via PBF is between 3 and 4% of the money that we make donations to the ANC. So we kind of, while we explore innovation of how we can raise funds, but we also have a responsibility of being a political party. So we cannot go beyond our core mandate of ensuring that the governing party serves its purpose. So that's why the issue of the regulation and increasing is based on the fact that we can't be the same people who violate the same legislations that we've put in place to Parliament.
All right. Thank you so much. I am looking at the time, but there are just 2 more questions. And I think this will be for you as well, Sipho. Then we'll go to the closing remarks. So there's one more. Can Sipho address issues on how then we can hold parties financially liable for not doing their work? Ish.
Well, I can't account for EFF, DA, Action SA. I'm also aware that, and that I think I must also respond to, the Attorney General, AG, also holds political parties accountable in Parliament, and Robin can also talk to that in terms of the funds that are spent, because there's 2 types of funding. There's what you call the multi-party funds, which comes from private donors. And then there's what we call the parliamentary allocation. In terms of Parliament, the Auditor General holds them accountable. ANC must also account in terms of GAP. GAP is General Accounting Standards. You can't just use money willy-nilly. Whatever funds that we use, we also accountable in terms of if there's fruitless and wasteful expenditure, we have to comply with the General Accounting Standards. So, but from the side of the ANC, we account, I mean, in December, the Treasurer General will be accountable to say, out of the money that we have received, so much are spent for what. So we also account to our members. So there's what we call the checks and balances. In Parliament, there's checks and balances, and internally, there are internal processes that we use for accountability.
Okay. And then here is, I'm not sure if this was answered already, but then there's one more. Can you share all your constituency officers' addresses and account for the amount of money spent on each?
So the Office of the Speaker, the parliamentary allocation, the other one, they can account for that. I'm aware of that through parliamentary processes. That's why you can able to pick up if they are scandals in terms of usage of flight tickets because of the systems in Parliament. That is my understanding.
Okay. I see Mr. Bantu has his hand up. Can I just ask you just 30 seconds because we do need to wrap up. So if you can just quickly, 30 seconds.
Okay, no, thank you very much, man. I know, I'm not sure if I would actually be, I just want to talk on the issue of the non-payment of the ANC staffers. I'm not sure maybe that it would be appropriate for me to pose that question. No, the TG is not here. Yeah. I mean, you can respond. I mean, the TG would have been better placed to respond to such a question. Yes. But since he's not here, I mean, I may as well. Yeah, I may as well.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I know that.
Can I quickly say something? I think and I'm sorry if I undermine, I come across as trying to block you. There are internal processes. For instance, employees are represented by organized labor. That's number one. Number two, for me, is an employer-employee matter that we're handling it. I'm not being dismissive, but I know that the finance team under the Office of the Treasurer General are working day and night. I'm in the Office of the Treasurer General. The programs under the Office of the General to try to address the issues of the employees. If just to go back one step, for 2 years, the country had a problem of COVID. We couldn't travel and so forth. Businesses were affected. It also reflects the state of our economy in a way. So, but I can assure you that this matter has been attended to. This morning I attended the meeting, internal meeting, and it's work in progress. I hope very soon, before the end of the week or early next week, the matter will have been resolved.
Okay.
Okay.
Are you sorted?
Thank you. Thank you very much. No. I just want to quickly amplify on what Mr. Mpele has just said there. I understand that you have said that the matter is an employee and an employer matter, and the matter is currently being dealt with. We understand that you have said that the financial constraints that the party has been dealing with, more in particular with the issues of the inflow of the private funding, has been actually one of the major factors that has actually constrained the finances of the party, which has then ultimately or consequently enabled the party to actually meet its certain commitments, like paying certain salaries on time. But you understand the level of the social and the socio-economic impact that this has had in the livelihoods of the workers. But how do you then ensure in the future that you will address these kind of issues in a manner that does not become detrimental to the livelihoods of the workers? It has, it's quite very, very bizarre. We understand that there are certain, party funding regulations and mechanisms in place that actually regulate how these monies must be spent. But I'm not too sure whether perhaps this has got to do with how the party prioritizes its spending or funding, because salaries actually talks to the bread and butter issues of your staffers. The prioritization of salary payments of the staffers, irrespective of the levels. I know that there are people who are very senior within the party structures who are located in the Luthuli House, and some of whom that we know would not be subjected or be affected by these kind of the party funding, challenges that it currently experiences. Why would these kind of issues, in the main, affect people who are at the junior phase, people who are helpless, people who are in the most vulnerable positions, who are the junior staffers in the party? And why would the party allow such a situation to continue for so long? We have now, received the reports, perhaps unverified or verified reports, that some of the staffers have been actually unpaid from as far back as dating from January, although we know that these matters have been actually so bizarre that they even caught the attention of the media. Some have been in the media headlines. It's actually... It's quite really shocking. We understand that the party is the governing party, and that it cannot actually do things.
Mr. Bantu, just 10 seconds because we have to start, please.
Yeah. So now it's just an upfront commitment that we want from the person who speaks on behalf of the party on how the party will ensure that it puts systems and processes in place to avert this kind of situation from resurfacing. We know that he has actually spoken on the matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bantu. Okay, so can we just get to closing remarks? Thank you so much to Sipho and to Robin and for everyone that just joined us. So Robin, any closing remarks?
Yes, and I'll keep this brief because I know we've taken up a lot of your time. I would just say a word of caution that we should not be sort of lulled into a false sense of security by what appears to be written down on paper and the kind of, I think, verbal gymnastics that our politicians and other representatives may say on the matter of accountability and transparency. And I'm just going to draw one example here, which I think Auta has already made in the Q&A boxes on the point of constituency offices and the fund that is funneled to political parties for constituency funds. In practice, you do not, in fact, find those constituency offices in your areas. It's very difficult for the people to hold their political parties to account, very difficult to find where those are, walk through the door, find somebody there to answer your questions. And then, of course, we then sit with this issue of, well, if money is being spent in the direction and we are not actually reaping the rewards of that, where does that money go? So I think this conversation, while brief, needs to continue, because not only my presentation, but also in the questions that were leveled here today, it seems very clear and apparent that we need to have a more in-depth look at, are our politicians, are our political parties actually working for us and in our interest? And the evidence does not seem to overwhelmingly come out in the positive for that.
People?
No, thanks to my vote counts for organizing these engagements, because it allows for ordinary men and women to engage. And we like to encourage you to organize such engagements on topical issues that affects our citizens, because these are platforms that they can engage with political leaders. And thanks to Robin for the insightful presentation, because it helps us to shape and also to allow ongoing, because that's a democracy that we fought for voices to be heard. And yeah, we're looking forward to participating in future engagements. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In the chat box, I left the link to the research. I will share this again as to everybody as well. Thank you for joining us again. Thank you, Sipho. I know you just joined us. We just found out like 2 minutes before that you'll be joining us in place of Mashitile. So thank you so much for your input, and goodbye, everyone. Have a good afternoon.